Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scott McKay.
All right. Welcome again, gentlemen, to another episode of The Big Show. This is the Mountaintop Podcast. My name is Scott McKay, at Scott McKay on Twitter, Real Scott McKay on Instagram, Scott McKay on YouTube. You can find us on the web at www.mountaintoppodcast.com. And as always, I cordially invite you, actually, I warmly invite you to join the Facebook group, which is called the Mountaintop Summit. Today, I have as a guest a new friend of mine who I have to tell you I was excited to meet. She's very fascinating. She's very charming and funny. And she is the author of a book called Questions to Ask Before You Jump into Bed. Now, before I go ahead and formally introduce you to her, I have to tell you, Emily brought my guest's book with her on the second or third date and kept bringing it for our next few dates. And it was so useful for creating conversation. And just about, a couple weeks ago, the idea of what to say on first dates came up for probably about the 100th or 200th time over the past 6 months. And my guest's book came to mind. And I said, you know what I should do? I should go find the author of this book, let her speak for herself, and have her on the show. And that's exactly what's taking place today. So Laurie Seale, author of Questions to Ask Before You Jump into Bed. Welcome to the Mountaintop Podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you on board. You know, I visited with you at great length about a week ago when we were planning this show, and you are sort of a Jacqueline of all trades. You're a very curious person, as am I, and all your life you've kind of devoted yourself to finding out more and learning. And since you wrote this particular book, which is, probably somewhere between 16 and 20 years ago now, you've been up to all sorts of things. What are some of your varied interests that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I always like to alleviate suffering. And after I wrote the book, what I noticed is that people would sometimes still be in suffering. And I evolved into a life longevity specialist with a holistic approach that includes food behavior and spiritual teaching. So it runs the gamut now, helping people change their thoughts, become more self-aware, helping them change their body. And people come to me because they don't like their ass, they don't like their marriage, they don't like something, they're unhappy, and they want to resolve it.
Yeah, there are more unhappy people than ever before nowadays. More people complaining, especially in our culture here in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. And yet, all the studies, all the metrics seem to indicate that life is actually easier and better than it ever has been. So what's up with that?
I think there's a contradiction between the social media presentation of who we are and who somebody really is. And if you listen to any of Joe Dispenza's work, he talks about the spiritual consciousness. The bigger the difference is between what you're pretending to be and who you really are, the bigger the addiction you're hiding. And often that's addiction to an emptiness or a loneliness.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I think people want to be part of something bigger because they really don't know where their faith is headed. They don't know what it is they're really living for. They don't know who or what it is they serve, and therefore they get on social media and, hey, look, here's this bigger cause that I can resonate with. Let me go hook, line, and sinker towards this. And the next thing you know, we're all sheep. And the next thing you know after that, we get on dates and we don't know how to talk to each other, do we? It's like a pandemic effect that social media and this kind of electronic socialization or facsimile thereof is kind of delivered unto us, right?
I think it creates kind of a vapidity, and vapidity isn't a word. So I think social media creates a vapidity, and I said that's not a word, so I'll say a vapid culture.
Yeah, okay. So vapidity, vapidousness, it's kind of like joyousness. You could probably just shorten it to joy, and it would still mean the same thing. So I guess vapidity or vapidousness would just be vap.
So it creates that in this instant gratification kind of communication. It's a communication where, because social media and communication and everything is happening so exponentially fast, the trading of information, there's an intensity of let's get to are we going to date? Are we going to marry? Are we going to have sex? What are we going to do? So let's just very quickly, oh, I know your last name. Okay. Where are we going to meet? Okay. And what's lost is this beautiful tapestry of discovering who someone is and being seen, so that people are really seen and appreciated. And that only comes, there's no way around that. That you could only do that and achieve that by spending time together and asking questions and dialoguing.
Right. And the interesting part about your book is it was written before social media even existed. So if anything,
right,
nowadays your book is more necessary than ever, wouldn't you think? Isn't that the trend you've seen?
I would say so, yes.
Yeah, why not? You're the author of it. Let's sell some books, right?
When I go on dates, or when I've gone on dates in the past, I find it so interesting because my natural curiosity, I have to rein it in, because I can sit and ask questions to anyone for hours and hours and hours, learning about who they are. I never run out of curiosity or questions. So if I rein that in and I wait for a man to ask me a question, after one question, there's nothing. There's just silence. And if I've said, is there something you'd like to know about me? Or is there something you would like to ask me about? And they're like, I can't think of a thing.
Yeah, I help guys with their online dating profiles. And part of what that entails, if they're going to do my top level version of that, that's absolutely the most effective, that I call the projection profile, is that I ask them, what is it about your favorite women you've ever known? Either women you've admired from afar, women you've dated, even women who are fictional characters or in a TV series or in movies that you just found wonderful in terms of their femininity and in terms of their virtue. What is the woman of your dreams like? And I would say probably 70 or 80% of the guys I talk to, they don't have anything. They're like, I got nothing. She's got nice body parts and she's sexy.
I love that question. And I'll take it one step further, because I've heard answers to that, because I've asked some of the same questions and said, what do you find noble about, or gracious, or compassionate, but there's a difference between the woman that they admire and then actually living with Joan of Arc. Living with Joan of Arc and dating her looks very different than flipping the page and going, wow, I admire her strength, because on Wednesday, maybe she's not available because she's on a mission. And then there's like the navigation of like coming together and going, well, okay, can you pause your revolution to spend time with me? And so what I found is there's a difference between what they admire and then what they have the bandwidth to spend time together with.
Well, I guess that's true. I mean, then again, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake at age 19, so she probably wouldn't have been good marriage material anyway.
Maybe she would have been perfect considering the average lifespan of a marriage.
Well, I suppose you could make that point, couldn't you? But on a more optimistic front, even getting guys to visualize the kind of woman who turns them on, the kind of woman they find interesting, is often an exercise in futility, because guys just can't imagine that way. So once they get on dates, it's unsurprising, utterly unsurprising, I might add, that they certainly don't know what questions to even ask of the woman who's in front of them. They don't know what to be curious about, or even how to be curious, or even what the boundaries are. A lot of guys are afraid to ask because they're afraid nowadays of offending any and every woman out there, because that's what the media has told them they should fear. Meanwhile, women may ask questions that sound more accusatory or even predatory than curious. And then the next thing you know, that couple isn't connecting. Once again, both of those people go back to their friends and go, well, now I've been on 10 or 12 dates in a row and I haven't connected with any of these people. But, the mindset isn't there to try to connect. It's more like, okay, I'm going to find out why I shouldn't date this other person, or what's wrong with them. I want to get that out of the way so I can weed them out. It's kind of a weeding out mentality, assuming they even get to the point where they meet each other because of the vapidity that you talked about previously. So, I think it's really a wonderful concept that you would pull together these questions to ask. And, the title of your book is rather poignant, questions to ask before you jump into bed. But indeed, Emily was using them simply as questions to get to know each other. And you've broken them down into 9 chapters. And I love how you've done that, because you can kind of go to the chapter for whatever mood you're in or whatever phase of the get to know you process you're in, and kind of take it from there. Right?
Right. So you have spirituality to in-laws to sex, vacations, anything you want to talk about.
I have to tell you this because you'll get a kick out of this. It was probably our 3rd or 4th date. And the first time Emily ever brought up sex with me was when she asked a question from your book. And I remember getting a little like bubble of nitrogen up my spine going, ooh, she's talking about sex now. It's looking good.
Yeah.
But that was the first time she ever mentioned it. And actually, we were getting along quite well by then. And I called her out on it, and she kind of sort of blushed. She was like, yeah, well, maybe. Depends on how you answer the questions.
Yeah. One of the responses I heard after I wrote the book also was that people would tell me, but Laurie, I don't know somebody to ask these questions. I have to know somebody to ask them. And that's an interesting concept. I have to know you without knowing you to feel safe to ask questions. And I said, actually, you could just ask questions. And if someone's uncomfortable answering that, that's their prerogative to say, I'm uncomfortable asking that. Could you ask me something else? I would like to be able to share. For example, if somebody said, Laurie, can you share your stock portfolio? I'm like, I so appreciate your curiosity. Really, I'm not going to share that today. But if you'd like to ask me something else, I'll answer it.
Well, fortunately, if you're not ready to hit the curveballs or the knuckleballs just yet, there are plenty of questions in your book that kind of serve as fungo or batting practice,
Yeah.
You can kind of start off with some of the easy ones, some of the softballs, as it were, before you play hardball with each other, right?
Right. And some of them are obviously lighter, like from where did you grow up, which is a common question, to how'd you spend your summers? Did you go to summer camp? And if you went to summer camp, where'd you go and what'd you like about it? A lot of people ask yes, no questions instead of open-ended questions that invite somebody to talk. So someone will say, Laurie, have you been married? Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. And then I'll wait for the next question. And are you asking me if I'm a bigamist? And they'll say, well, are you divorced? And I say, no, I'm not divorced.
I'm laughing because people do this habitually.
Mm-hmm.
They'll get together with each other. I mean, even on job interviews, the hiring manager will go, so are you interested in this job or whatever? And they'll go, yes. And there'll be like awkward silence. And it'll be like, oh, okay. So, the epidemic of the closed end question. You brought up bigamy, and it reminded me of an old Marx Brothers movie where Groucho is talking about marrying two different women. And just casually, and the lady goes, why, Groucho, that's bigamy. And Groucho goes, big of you, it's big of me. Do you know how much it costs to support two women nowadays? So every time I hear that word, I think of Groucho.
Sounds like Groucho.
Yeah, no apology either. It's funny. I mean, all the good jokes were wide open back then, right? When the movies first started, especially when talking pictures first started, like in the early 30s, all the great comedy was still out there to be served up. There was no such thing as an old joke yet, right?
One of the points that I was trying to make with the book are people will say, well, when I ask, am I looking for someone just like me? And we briefly touched on this on our first date, you and I, when we were talking last week.
Shh, don't tell anybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
it's hush hush.
There's two frames of thought. If you're looking for somebody same, or someone that's different. And so I think that goes to what you were saying about using questions to weed people out versus using discussions to understand the context of how someone forms beliefs and values.
I also think it says a lot about whether they're actually seeking connection and intimacy or trying to ward it off, maybe even unbeknownst to their own self.
I think that's unbeknownst. A lot of men are unaware that they long for emotional connection, but they're unaware that they're behaving in ways that will not create emotional connection.
Yeah, I buy that. I also think a lot of guys are missing out on an experience that they have not yet had in life, not realizing what they're missing out on.
I'll also say there's a big difference in culture. Because I've been single now for a couple of years after my marriage was annulled, I've dated gone out with many different cultures, Black, Asian, white, Hispanic. There's really a big difference between cultures.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And what the expectations are, even in terms of what's acceptable to talk about when you first get to know each other, the speed with which we're moving towards physical intimacy, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So in your book, you've broken it down into 9 chapters.
Okay.
And I've kind of paraphrased your chapter titles so we can get to the meat and potatoes of what you wrote about. Okay. The first one is knowing yourself, and you're obviously a big proponent of knowing who you are and what you're about before you go traipsing around trying to figure out who you're looking for, right?
Well, yeah, the concept is the Socrates concept of know thyself. And so it's really, if you're going to pose a question to someone else, you really need to have the answer or what you believe or what resonates for you. So the idea is you could hardly know if somebody's resonating with you unless you know yourself first.
Now, skipping to your 9th chapter, just because I think it'll fit the order of our discussion a little better, are the quirky conversation starters. These are kind of the no-brainers. It's a first date. We're just trying to see if we can get along here. And these are questions that catalyze the get-to-know-you process. I love them. And you know what? I think it's genius that you would include a whole chapter on that, because people really do have a hard time knowing even where to start with each other once they sit down. The nerves are there. They're wondering how they look. They're wondering if the other person likes them, if they really secretly like to end this right now, ask for the check and leave. And that can only mean that the idea of actually having a conversation sometimes creates a lot of pressure and people just draw a blank, right?
I think so. Are you familiar with Neil Warren Clark? He started eHarmony.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Okay, so I had a couple of meetings with him after writing the book. And he has a philosophy that if sexual connection isn't there immediately, give it 6 months, but people give it less than 6 minutes. And he says if intellectual connection is not there, give it about 10 dates. In other words, a sexual connection, we are so optically trained that we look at someone and go, I don't like the way you look. But if you actually develop connection, you develop kind of a conspiracy together and a communion, and that actually triggers endorphins of sexual attraction. So the intellectual connection needs to be there pretty quickly, but the sexual chemistry can actually develop over time from conversation and shared experiences.
Well, I think that's all well and good for him, but every time I've ever been with a woman where it lasted, I was hot for almost immediately, in my own case. I think there are a lot of people who settle for each other because over time they go, well, you know what? I'm going to learn to love this person. I'm going to learn to be sexually attracted to them. I'm going to love them for their mind, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's always going to be someone who's more attractive, someone who's more interesting, who may have perhaps been a better, more obvious match for that person, except they were so afraid of quitting and starting all over again and perhaps not finding anybody that they ended up going overtime with someone who probably wasn't the best option for them. You're welcome to disagree with me, but in my case, that's generally been how it worked.
That's fine. You know, our society is so physically driven that people would say, well, why do I have to ask questions before sex? And I'm like, well, you can jump into bed with somebody, but people sometimes have a tendency that after you've had sex, they kind of edit their answers. And sometimes they edit their answers before trying to get to have sex with someone. So that's why, and people are like, well, why are there so many questions? I'm like, because if you ask around a subject and you ask 10 questions around a subject, you're going to hear more of the whole truth than if you just ask one question and get one answer.
Well, I think we as guys in particular are often very guilty of withholding the right questions, the proper questions, until after we've been to bed with a woman. Like, what do you want out of this relationship? Or what does sex mean to you? And they kind of just seduce her and then go, oh, wait a minute, you wanted a relationship? Well, I'm not interested in that at all. And then you leave a trail of broken hearts, you know?
Totally agree. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. I mean, not that women don't withhold questions that are very key also, but I am all about full disclosure, coming from an abundance mentality at the beginning rather than this parsimonious poverty mentality that seems to dictate to a lot of guys, hey, you know what? If I ask too many questions, or even if I'm too vulnerable up front about who I really am, this woman is not going to have sex with me. So I'm just going to stick to a hard seduction process, pick out all the shrapnel and sort out all the mayhem sometime after all the feelings get frazzled and I've got an angry, upset, deeply heartbroken woman on my hands. And I obviously am not an advocate of that at all. I always exhort guys very, very strongly to be upfront about what they want, about what they're looking for in a relationship, even on the second date. Maybe not the first date because you're just getting to know each other and decide whether you even want to have a second date, right? But, you know, certainly by the second date, ask a woman where she's coming from, what she's looking for from her dating life right now, and you actually may get a non-stereotypical answer anyway. So my thought process, and it has borne itself in reality, not only through my own personal life, but through the experiences of guys I've coached and the stories I've heard, that being honest and upfront about this is always the best policy, because you can still often have exactly the kind of relationships you want. And then you also have that opportunity to grow maybe what's a physical relationship up front into something deeper later. as you both continue on in that relationship and get to know each other. And also, a lot of guys are looking for a relationship with a woman that's going to head towards marriage, or at least a committed relationship, very early on themselves, which breaks the stereotype in its own right. And a lot of times they're assuming this is what's going on with a woman, and they jump into bed with her without asking lots of your wonderful, poignant questions, and they get broken from that. So, even though the stereotypes exist, it always serves everybody's purpose, both potential partners in a relationship's purpose, to ask lots of questions and get to know you in a very real, authentic, and vulnerable way up front.
I would totally agree. And even if both people happen to discover on a date, yes, we both want a long-term relationship. Yes, we both seek marriage. By asking some more questions, you might discover that would be fabulous right after their date maybe dissolves some credit that they've got going on, or maybe they come with the baggage of an ex-husband that's crazy, or maybe you're going on a date with somebody who has 10 children. So even if you both want a relationship, you might learn some things about one another that would preclude that person being your next spiritual partner.
Hence some of the deeper chapters in your book, like deal breakers and the one on past relationships and behavior, right? Or even
Correct.
Spirituality. That's important.
Correct.
Yeah. There's also another chapter in your book on passion and purpose, which ostensibly is a wonderful conversation that leads all sorts of great and happy places, once the couple starts getting to know each other, right?
Yes, I think that's also individual. Like, what is your individual passion in life for, as well as what is your own purpose for? What is your purpose-driven life? So it's not just that relationship, but more to the individual.
Yes, and probably my favorite chapter is about when you're in a hurry. It's actually the second chapter of the book, and it's all about when you want to get to the bottom of this, when you want to get to know someone and figure out whether this is going to even be a date or not, or where we should go with this, if we should go anywhere with it at all. And I thought that was really genius of you to come up with a whole section of questions specifically for, hey, we don't know each other. Let's get this thing going and see if we stand a chance. I thought that was great.
I could tell you a funny story about that.
Please do.
So yesterday I was going to have blood work drawn, and I went to see a chiropractor who was ordering the blood work, and he was probably 10 years younger than me. And so he's filling in the paperwork. Laurie Seale, okay, and where are you? Perimenopause, you're 53. And I'm like, are you asking me to have your child? Because I'm really attracted to you, but I'm sorry, I can't have your babies anymore. I'm in menopause. And he goes, okay, menopause, check. We'll fill that out. And he just kept going through the paperwork, and it was just me being playful.
Yes, of course, being purely professional.
Oh, no. Not at all. Just playful. Just playful.
What is it about us best-selling authors where we think we can go into the offices of these professionals like medical doctors and, break bad with them and call them by their first name and joke with them instead of hanging on their every word and giving them unmitigated respect and calling them Dr. So-and-so, in hushed tones? You know what I call my doctor? I call her Sawbones.
I don't know what it is. I would always throw out professional for playful.
Oh, yeah.
I had another funny story. I was standing at the tailor, and I was measuring the inseam of jeans that I was going to cut off. And there was a man at the counter, and I was actually there with someone that I spend romantic time with. He was sitting down. I measured from the crotch, like down below the knees. And I looked up at the person I was dating, and I kind of mouthed, I think this is the length. And the man standing at the counter looked at me, and then I looked at him, and I'm like, long, super long, like, wow. And the guy that I was with was so mortified. And I looked at the guy at the counter and I said, you're obviously married. Is your wife the playful, mischievous one, or are you the playful, mischievous one? And he goes, I am. And I winked at him and he's like, I get it.
Yes, I love to bring out the playful, feminine mischief in my wife, and I'm very good at it, which she appreciates wildly.
Right. I think that's all about, can you surprise someone in a public setting? This person, who shall remain nameless, has both anxiety, trepidation, and excitement when he's out with me because he's never sure what's going to come out of my mouth in a public place. And there's usually a lot of playfulness with that.
Yeah, that can be a lot of fun for the right person. My tailor is a Taiwanese lady.
Mine is also Asian, yes.
Yes, and she always shakes her finger at me and tells me to eat vegetables.
Yes.
You need to eat vegetables. I mean, and I'm actually kind of trim nowadays, and she's telling me keep eating vegetables, and she has that wonderful Asian acerbic wit where she's kind of playing like she's complaining at you and nagging you and telling you what to do, but really she has a smile on her face, even though she's kind of play acting it. And having been to that part of the world, I actually serve it right back up to her. And she finds that delightful. So I'm right back at her like, maybe you should come over to my house and I cook some real food for you because you're in America now. We eat more than just vegetables. We don't eat just bok choy here. And she'll look at me with this stern face, and then finally both of us will just bust up laughing. And then she'll go back into serious mode and go, all right, what do you have for me to fix up for you today? And I'll throw a pair of pants I just bought up there or whatever. And she'll look at me and go, next Thursday. And I'll look at her and go, next Wednesday. And she'll look at me and again pause and just start laughing. And then the people behind us in line are completely nonplussed by this. Like, what are these two people doing? But she knows me by name, and she always these days greets me with a big smile. And it's just a lot of fun because we're challenging each other. And I just love that playfulness. And I love how, like you said, cultures are different. People interpret this style of play or whatever differently. And it's always so appreciated by other people when you take the time to figure out where they're coming from. And I think that's what your book's all about is, hey, instead of me just hoping you're going to like me for who I am and my need to impress you, I want to learn more about you. I want to see what makes you tick. And I think when two people can use a tool like the book you've written, Laurie, it just makes that process go easier than it probably would have if left to its own devices. So I just want to thank you for writing the book, and I think it's a delight, and I think you're very charming and delightful as well.
Thank you.
So thank you for coming on the show today. What I want to do is I want to give these guys a chance to pick up their own copy of Questions to Ask Before You Jump into Bed. So what I've done is I've set up a special URL that leads to the Amazon page where you can pick up a copy of Laurie's book. And that's there for you at www.mountaintoppodcast.com/jump. Like, might as well jump. Questions to ask before you might as well jump into bed. So, www.mountaintoppodcast.com/jump, JUMP. Get yourself a copy of Laurie Seale's book. I've also added it to my Amazon influencer page where you can get Laurie's book along with books by other authors who have visited this show. So once again, thank you so much, Laurie Seale, for joining us today. It's been a fun conversation.
Thank you.
And guys, if you haven't been to www.mountaintoppodcast.com, the main site, you could download transcripts of every episode back to number 150, get free reports, see pictures of our illustrious guests, and get in on my newsletter if you haven't already, where I'll send you actionable advice every day on how to get better with women, how to be a better man. And you can also sign up to talk to me for 25 minutes for free using the button on that page that says Talk to Scott for 25 minutes. It's usually on the upper right-hand corner of the page, unless my webmaster's been added again. And what happens is you get on my calendar, we talk for 25 minutes about what's going on in your life, what your goals are, what you'd like to see happen within the next 12 months, and perhaps put a plan of action together to get you to that point and get you the results you want and deserve. It's all there for you at www.mountaintoppodcast.com. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scott McKay from X&Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X&Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X&Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.